Hello and welcome back to the second tutorial on making space rocks in GameMaker. If you're here, then that means you've opted to use GML to continue with this series. So before we get started, let's just have a think about all of the elements that we're going to have to create for our project. So in the game, we have a ship that is controlled by the player. We can tilt the ship left and right, and then we can also move by pressing forwards. We also have some asteroids that the player can interact with, and I just want to give you a heads up that there will be pop-ups throughout this video that will expand on what I'm describing. So I encourage you to pause and have a read of those when they come up. So if you haven't already, create a new project in GML. And now before we do anything else, I'm just going to come over to the main game options and change my frames per second. So we can do that here with the little cog, or we can also come into options in the main. And we'll just change that to 60 FPS because that is the industry standard. And we'll hit OK. Alright, the next thing I want to do is make our sprites. So remember, sprites are how we represent images in GameMaker. So let's make a new sprite. And I'm going to make this SPR, which stands for sprite, ship. Alright, so the assets I'm going to be making today are going to be very basic, so you should be able to follow along even if you're not much of an artist. I'm certainly not. But if you want, you can also just download the assets that I have created. So the first thing that we kind of have to decide is how big the sprites are going to be. So if you want more drawing space, then feel free to make this larger. I'm actually going to keep this one at 32 by 32. So we double click here to start editing the image. And I'm just going to draw a very basic ship. So I'm going to turn on this grid just to help me with drawing it. And you can change the size of the grid like this. Alright, so that is my ship. The next thing that we have to have a think about is this thing. So if you just click on this picture, we are setting what's called the origin of the sprite. And this is kind of where the sprite is going to be anchored to, and also where the object will be anchored to. So basically where the XY position of the object will be in the room. So if we leave it up the top left, then that means, for example, when we're turning the ship, it's going to start turning from the top left. So it's going to turn very strangely. But we want it to turn from the middle. So I'm going to change this to be the middle center. Alright, next up, I'm going to make 3 different asteroids. So I'm going to make a small one, which is going to be 16 by 16. And I'll also just put it in the middle center. And then I'm going to make a medium one, which will be 32 by 32. And a huge one, which will be at 64 by 64. So they're all kind of half of each other, so that when we're breaking them apart, they can kind of halve into 2 more asteroids. So again, I'm going to draw them quite simplistically. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and I'll speed this bit up and come back to you when I'm finished. Alright, so these are my asteroids. So just make sure that all of them are centered at the middle center, and that is all for the sprites. Now let's make the objects. The objects, right-click and make a new object. We'll call our first one Obj Ship, and you'll see here that we can actually assign a picture to this object so that when it's in the room, it won't just be an invisible object. This will mean that it will draw this sprite. So we have now set its sprite index to SPR Ship. Let's also create Obj Asteroid, and I'm actually only going to have one asteroid object, and we can just set any of these for now. But what I'm actually going to have it do is randomly select from 3 of these sprites when it's created. So that way we're going to get some different kind of objects appearing in the game. So if we come now to our rooms. So for the time being, we're just going to have one room just to test our game. And I'll call this RM game. And we can just drag our objects in here. And if we run the game now, we should see those coming up. Alright, so there they are. So obviously we can't actually move yet because we haven't added any input to our objects. And you'll also notice just the size of the screen. At the moment, the size of this game window is the same size as the room. So it's 124 pixels by 768. So maybe let's just change that. I'm going to make this 500 by 500, which is kind of small, but it's a pretty retro looking game, so I think it's going to fit with it. So if we run the game now, you can see that the game window is a lot smaller and it matches the size of the room. You can actually make game windows that are different to the size of the room, which has to do with the viewports, but we're not going to cover that in this tutorial. Alright, so let's come back to the workspace. And let's do the logic for our ship. So let's make this ship move. So remember how I said in the previous tutorial that our fundamental logic of programming is basically if this, then that? Or in GameMaker, it would be if an event happens, do a certain action. So to make the ship move according to our input, an event that we could use is the keyboard presses. So we could create 3 events and put the different logic inside these events. But another thing you can do is also use what's called the step event. The step event is a really important event. It's actually akin to a frame of the game. So remember how we set our game to be 60 frames per second? Well, in GameMaker, frames are basically called steps. And so there are 60 steps in a second. So this means that whatever code we put in here is going to be run 60 times per second. And the benefit of putting all of them in the step event is that we can see all the logic at once. So I'm just going to create some room and dock these panels. And we'll make this a little bit larger. And let's have a think. So in plain English, what we want to do is basically say, if we press let's go with the left key, then we want to tilt the ship a certain direction. So in code, what we can do is use the if statement. So if something, which we put in these parentheses, then we use curly brackets to say what we want it to do. So anything in the curly brackets going to be performed if this is true. So I could say if 1 equals 1, that is true. So it's going to run this code in the curly brackets. But what we're checking, of course, is the input. So now, at this stage, I just want to say there is a lot to explore in GameMaker. There's an entire language of GML, but in these tutorials, I'll pretty much only have time to go over the relevant functions and variables. So if there's anything, even in the interfaces that I don't discuss, any buttons or anything, feel free to hover over them, look them up in the manual, play around with the values. It really is the best way to learn. And a great place to start is the manual. So for example, if I wanted to find out how to get the input, I could come over to the scripting, GML, reference, and I can have a look in the control functions, keyboard input. So this will tell us exactly how to get input from the keyboard. So we can use this keyboard check. So this keyboard check is checking if we're pressing the A button. And there's a few different functions so we can check if a key is pressed, if it's released, or if it's just down. Right? So if I'm pressing the key down, I want it to keep spinning. I don't want it to do it just once, which is what's going to happen if we use pressed. So if we press the left key, and we can see here that left key is VK left. So if we put keyboard check, the function's going to pop up. And then inside these brackets, so be careful of your brackets here, we can put VK left. So now we want to spin the ship. And again, in the manual, there is a variable called image angle that we can change. And this is to do with the rotation of the sprite. And one important thing to note here is what direction is in GameMaker. So right, as it says, is 0 degrees. So 0 degrees actually starts here, just like it does on the unit circle. And then the top is going to be 90 degrees, left is 180, and down is 270. So it is actually important how you've drawn the sprite. So note how I've drawn the ship pointing to the right. This is what we want because this means it's pointing 0 degrees. And then if we change the angle, it's going to match exactly what the direction is. So make sure your ship is pointing to the right. Okay, so what we want to do is change the value of image angle. So basically we want to add to it. We want to make it equal itself plus, because remember we're going that way. So plus, let's just do 5. Another way to write this is image angle plus equals 5. So it's equal to itself plus 5. And let's just copy this for the right, except instead of adding, we want to subtract. All right, so let's test that. So press left and right, and you can see that we're moving the ship. Okay, now for movement. So we're going to do VK up. Generally, the way that we make things move in GameMaker is changing their XY position in the room. So you can see, even in here, that the XY position of objects changes as I move this. So over here is 0, and over here it's increasing. And the same actually goes for Y, so the origin is actually up the top, and it increases as we go down. But to actually get the ship to move as if it's in outer space, we want it to be using momentum, and that actually involves calculating a bunch of vectors, and I don't want to have to do a 30-minute math lecture here, so we are just going to use a built-in function, motion add. So this, you can just middle click on this to bring up the documentation page if you want to have a read, basically adds a certain amount of movement in a certain direction. So the direction that we want to add the movement is just going to be the image angle. And then the speed, if we're pressing the up key for quite a few seconds, that's going to be running this code, because it's the step event, 60 times per second. So if we put a number like 1, that's actually going to be increasing the speed up to 60 in just 1 second. So it's going to be going extremely fast. So we actually don't want to add too much. I'm going to make it a very small number, and feel free to play with these values if you want. All of this is just how I have set this out. There is literally infinity ways to code something. So don't think I have a bunch of magic numbers and I am all-knowing. I definitely am not. This is just one way to do it. Okay, let's test that. So move and press forwards and we're moving. Okay, that's great. But you'll notice as we go outside the room, we kind of disappear. What we're going to do is actually have the object wrap around the room when it goes outside. And so we could set up logic here ourselves. We could check if the X position of the player is outside the room, so it could be is less than 0 and is larger than 500. But again, our life can be made easier if we use a built-in function. So there's one called move wrap. And again, if we bring up the documentation, it tells you exactly what it does. So it's going to wrap an instance that leaves the room. And you can actually just use it to horizontally or vertically wrap. We're going to say that we want it to do both. And we can also set a margin. So let's say true, true, and let's just set the margin to 0 for now because I want to show you what it means. It's a bit hard to describe. So if we go outside the room, you can see it kind of pops over to the edge and it looks a little bit clunky. And that's because it is warping the player as soon as its origin, which is in the center, reaches the edge of the screen. And its nose is kind of appearing too far over too quickly. What we could do is make sure the entire thing is over before we have it appear here. So I'm going to set that margin to be half the size of the ship. So we can use a built-in variable called sprite width. We could also just use sprite height because they're actually the same and divide that by 2. So if we do it now, we can see it's a little smoother. Okay, now our asteroids in the game weren't actually moving or doing anything and we just had that one kind of object. So let's have it that when they're created, so in the create event, so this event, unlike the step event, it runs once, only once when the object is created and then never again. So this is a great place for us to do any kind of setup for the object. So this is where you would declare variables and also perform once-off actions. So for example, right now I want to change its sprite index to be one of 3 things. So this one, or this one. And there is a handy function called choose, which is kind of like a random picker. So whatever we put in here, so 1, 2, 3, it will randomly choose from these and then spit out one of them. But instead of numbers, we're going to put sprites. And what I'm going to do, because you can actually open these parentheses and have them over multiple lines, and it can kind of help with readability because I don't have much space here. I'm going to say SPR asteroid small, SPR asteroid medium, and SPR asteroid huge. Okay, cool. So we have set the sprite index. So if you ran that now, you should see that its sprite index is changing to be either small, medium, or large. So another thing I want it to do is as soon as it gets created, choose a random direction and kind of head in that direction. So there are a few other built-in variables you can use. So the direction, which is different than the image angle, because the image angle is just about how it's drawing, but the direction is to do with the movement of the object, so where the object is moving. I'm going to get it to choose a random number between 0 and 359, right? So I'm not going to include 360 just because that's the same as 0 degrees. And I might also just do the same for the image angle, just so all of the asteroids start off looking a little bit differently. And even though we've set the direction, we're actually not moving yet, right? We would have to change the speed. So let's change the speed to be 1. And then, because it's now moving just like the player object, I want it to also do this wrapping. So let's just copy that and add it into the step event. And maybe another thing we can do is to just have the asteroid slowly rotating. So we could add to the image angle. So image angle equals image angle plus 1, or you could just write image angle plus equals 1. That would be saying the same thing. So now if we run the game, there we go. We've got our asteroids all wrapping around the room. Next time, we're going to be working on some shooting and collisions. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you next time.